This is the story of a man who faced his destiny alone. In the space of a few hours, he became a rebel, an outcast, an outlaw, a deserter almost. Even though he had spent most of his life in the military discipline, and even though he was a general and a minister in the government of the French Republic. On the 16th of June 1940, he took the hardest decision of his life. The next day, Charles de Gaulle flew to London and broke all ties with the legal authorities to face alone an incredible challenge. Deprived of everything, without help and with a handful of supporters, he refused to surrender and started the reconquest of France from abroad. What would this provisional general, an abdicative fugitive and soon to be condemned under Secretary of State, do in order for him to become the embodiment of an entire nation? How did he become the last resort of a war-torn France? Charles de Gaulle. Few names in the history of France resonate as strongly as this one. And few characters have made their mark on their country as deeply as he has. We all know the legend. That of a man who, alone against all, refused to surrender to Nazi barbarism and with unwavering determination led Free France to a final victory. Everyone remembers his appeal of the 18th of June 1940 on London radio, broadcast again several days later.
Les Français libres n'acceptent pas cette défaite.
This appeal that transformed the course of history and made an obscure general one of the greatest figures of the 20th century was made by de Gaulle in desperation, because the government which he had been part of for less than 2 weeks was willing to surrender to the enemy's diktat. It all happened in a few days, in a few hours even, a few chaotic days during which would determine the fate of the war. A war which had started on the 3rd of September 1939, more than 9 months ago. During the first 8 months of the conflict, fighting had been limited to a few skirmishes between outposts. And then suddenly, Hitler started to attack. On that day, the German army, the Wehrmacht, launched a new kind of blistering offensive on the Netherlands and Belgium, completely disrupting the battle plans of the Allies. First came an intensive air raid designed to disrupt the defensive lines. Then a squadron of tanks rushed into the attack to break through different points of the front lines. The masses of infantry rushed through these breaches opened by fire and armoured trucks to encircle and reduce resistance points. This was the Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War. The Belgian, British and French armies were stunned by the force of the strike and the speed of the German advances. In just over a week, the Germans had driven 1 million French and British men into the Dunkirk pocket. On the 26th of May, the British troops began their evacuation, which ended on the 3rd of June. On the 6th of June, Belgium surrendered. Lille fell shortly after. Then the Somme. Lyon and Marseille were bombed. On the 9th, the Germans reached Rouen. On the 10th, Paris was declared an open city. The Battle of France could no longer have been won. The choices available to the French leader boiled down to a tragically simple alternative: to surrender or to continue fighting. Two stances embodied by the two men who were still running this dying government. Prime Minister Paul Renaud and Deputy Prime Minister Marshal Philippe Pétain. When Renaud had nominated Pétain a month earlier as Deputy Prime Minister, the idea was that the old Marshal would embody national unity against the German invaders at his side. His prestige would compel recognition and would end all political squabbles that paralysed his government. But as soon as he was nominated, Pétain showed his opposition to Renaud. He headed the conspiracy of the defeatists who wanted to negotiate an armistice with Hitler, disregarding the treaties that bound France to England and which prohibited either of these countries to conclude a separate peace with the enemy. This confrontation between Pétain and Renaud came to a head on the 15th of June. In one of the last meetings of the government, Dьо Gol, who had been appointed Under Secretary of State in charge of war 9 days ago, remained silent.
I would like to speak.
Marshal.
Mr. President, under the dramatic circumstances we are facing today, my honor as a soldier orders me to give up the responsibilities.
Oh no, you're not going to do that. Not right now.
The responsibilities that have been entrusted to me by this government. Only an armistice request would allow the country to avoid catastrophe and collapse. And to rise again, it could only rely on itself, stripped of its allies, who did not support it enough during the war. My duty, since these conditions have not been met, is therefore to present my resignation with immediate effect.
Pétain wanted to preserve what remained of the army, even if it meant leaving part of the national territory to the enemy and sacrificing this republic he did not care for. Renaud, on the other hand, wanted to fight. Long before the war, he had lucidly denounced the dangers Hitler posed to democracies. And no one took any notice. He only came to power in March 1940, but he was already exhausted, discouraged, surrounded on all sides by naysayers, his wife included, Hélène de Porte, who went behind his back to make him give in. She even made her presence felt in the cabinet meetings.
Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, since you are showing me here a written request, you will understand that I must respond to you in writing. We will discuss your resignation later. And I ask you to sit down so we can continue.
No, I am standing. I'll remain as such.
Marshal, sit down.
No, I will not sit down.
Anyway, we cannot engage in an armistice without consulting our allies first. We have already asked them about this, and we are expecting an answer from London at any time now. I suggest we postpone this meeting until later. Let's meet at 4 o'clock. Gentlemen, I won't keep you.
Dьо Gol was infuriated by this meeting, although he did not show it. All the more so, as since the late 20s he had been campaigning for another military doctrine, a more offensive strategy, predicting the worst if he weren't listened to. No one wanted to listen, and the worst happened. Dьо Gol had always dreamed of saving France. At 15, he wrote a fiction story in which he was the hero and where he told the story of the fall of France and how he rescued it. Son of the Lille bourgeoisie, a Catholic, social-minded and a patriot, the young Dьо Gol chose the army. He entered Saint-Cyr and embarked upon a military career. His first assignment in 1912. The 33rd Infantry Regiment was stationed at Arras and was commanded by Colonel Philippe Pétain. It was the first meeting between these two men that fate would bring together and who would then oppose each other over 4 decades. Immediately, Pétain liked de Gaulle, who admired him. The young man was gifted, irritable, cultivated, taciturn and confident. Everything about this young lieutenant pointed towards a brilliant career, as evidenced by his first service record. This officer is talented and is very promising. Encourage and track him. A skillful speaker, deserves the highest praise, deserves a lot of attention. He still had one more test to pass: firing. From the onset of the war, Lieutenant de Gaulle demonstrated a great sense of duty, accentuated by strong physical courage. On the 15th of August 1914, 12 days after the start of the war, his leg was fractured by a bullet during an assault in Belgium. Seven months later, he was wounded again, this time on his left hand. In March 1916, he was speared by a bayonet. His name was added to the list of the dead on the battlefields. Dead, him? No. Only a prisoner. He escaped 5 times. Each time he was captured again before reaching the French lines. He ended the war in the camps of the Kaiser. Between his escapes, he filled his time with what he called a shameful exile, by giving lectures in military strategy to his companions in misfortune. When he returned to France, he quickly climbed up the ladder. Assigned to the General Staff, his lectures at the École Militaire attracted a lot of attention. His theory was for the return of the war of movement, like at the time of the great Napoleonic cavalry charges, which opened a breach in the enemy lines where the mass of infantry could dive into. With the exception, he said, that tanks would replace horse riders with an otherwise devastating firepower. He pleaded so passionately for the creation of a professional army corps, motorized, armored, and supported by aviation, that he was nicknamed Colonel Motors. But he preached to a brick wall. Pioneering theories were mistrusted by his superiors, who were further annoyed by his reasoning and sharp mind that often passed for arrogance. Worse, in the 4 books he published between 1924 and 1938, he argued that it was the political power that had to dictate to its staff in all circumstances. A heresy at a time when military leaders dictated their choices to an endlessly changing government. Choices that boiled down to this relentlessly drummed out incantation. The strategy used for the victory of 1918 was the only worthwhile one. And it was by digging trenches and by keeping whatever fortified positions they had at all costs that this victory had been won, not by charging with swords drawn over the enemy lines. Indeed, France had equipped itself with the most extraordinary network of fortified positions ever built. The Maginot Line had to stop the enemy entirely.
Dans la ligne Maginot, seuls les organes de feu et de guet affleurent à la surface, tout en restant invisibles. Des collines entières ont été percées de galeries et de chambres jusqu'à des profondeurs insoupçonnées. Celle-ci constitue une des réalisations les plus importantes du siècle. Elle est une des pièces capitales du système défensif français et seconderait efficacement en cas d'invasion toutes les armes chargées de la protection du territoire.
And so why waste time building motorized divisions made for an offensive that this irksome and crank Colonel de Gaulle so vigorously demanded? Because as he answered in his book Towards a Professional Army, published in 1934, the fortified positions of the Maginot Line only protected the border with Germany. And in 1914, the German army had gone further north through Belgium to attack. This hole in the fence is the age-old weakness of the country, he wrote. In this deadly boulevard we buried a third of our youth. According to Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments for Nazi Germany, Hitler had repeatedly claimed that he had read and reread Colonel de Gaulle's book, and he had learned a lot from it. In France, Paul Renaud alone defended the views developed by de Gaulle to the National Assembly, demanding that the French army equipped itself with a large number of tanks and modern aircraft. But no one listened. The French leaders were pragmatic, realistic and peaceful. They preferred to remain prudent and faint of heart and refused to see the German danger. Their blindness led them to let Hitler impose his law on all of Europe until the world was dramatically thrown into the deadliest war in history. In March 1936, Hitler installed the Wehrmacht in the Rhineland. This was a clear violation of the 1918 peace treaty that forbade Germany to station any troops in this region which borders with the French territory. England did not react. The French government expressed shock but did nothing. 2 years later, the German troops entered Austria and the country was simply annexed to the Third Reich. The British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain said, "This is not the time to make hasty decisions," and did nothing. In France, the prevailing opinion was the same: keep quiet. After all, if that was the price of peace, Austrians could well become Germans. 6 months later, and Hitler attacked Czechoslovakia. He imposed the disastrous Munich Agreement on the democracies, which gave him the right to annex any regions populated with German minorities. In 1939, it was Poland's turn to face an unacceptable ultimatum. On behalf of the German minority in East Prussia, Hitler demanded that a portion of Poland be given to him. This time he had gone too far. France and England, bound by a treaty of assistance to Poland, could not turn their backs. The war had begun. Or rather, the phony war. The British and the French on one side, and the Germans on the other, observed one another over the Rhine for months. The English press spoke of the phony war, and the German propaganda of the seated war. Yet in the early days of the conflict, while most of the Wehrmacht was still mobilized on the Polish front, French troops had launched an offensive against Germany on the Saar. They had met no resistance and had easily penetrated the enemy defenses. What would have happened had the Allies pushed forward their advantage? No one will ever know. Because after 3 days of the offensive, General Gamelin, who headed the French General Staff, decided to retreat. The troops withdrew behind the Maginot Line and quietly awaited the German attack. An incredible mistake, one which surely contributed more than any other to the defeat of May 1940. Why? Because Gamelin was one of the architects of the victory in 1918, was also one of the fiercest advocates of defensive strategy. But his prestige was considerable, and nobody dared to question his choices. until Hitler started the fires of the Blitzkrieg on Belgium. As Colonel de Gaulle had foreseen years earlier, the Germans launched their attack north on the deadly Belgian boulevard and bypassed the Allied defences. Immediately, the French and English armies moved towards the north to meet the Wehrmacht, while behind them, through the Ardennes, the German armoured divisions launched a second deadly offensive that caught them off guard. Gamelin was dismissed, and General Maxime Weygand, who was stationed in Syria, was brought back in a hurry to replace him. Weygand, another figure of the Great War, was also overwhelmed by the violence and the speed of the German attack. Yet he understood that a radical change of strategy was needed to save what could still be saved. Infuriated and dismayed, de Gaulle witnessed the enemy's application of the theories he had defended in vain for more than 10 years. Standing alone against all, he had been right. And so what? In those dramatic hours, the country didn't need an eccentric officer who had been right all along. It needed a new Clemenceau or another Napoleon. What France needed was a saviour. His time would come, but at that moment, it was on the battlefield that Charles de Gaulle had to prove himself. While the country was in collapse, he was appointed head of a tank regiment where he would finally be able to put his theories into practice. His mission was to slow the advance of the German army, which was rushing towards the sea, by attacking its flank with his armoured division. Between the 4th and 17th of May, de Gaulle gathered his troops. 85 disparate tanks, without logistical support, without refuelling means, and without radio equipment. Despite all of this, on the 17th in the morning, he launched his troops through the German lines in the direction of a village in l'Aisne called Montcornet. The first tanks occupied the village but could not be pushed any further due to a lack of fuel. The Germans fought back, the French retreated. De Gaulle then launched a second attack and sent infantry units at his command to reduce the pockets of resistance. His armoured division, made of scraps and odds and ends, achieved its objective. In Montcornet, de Gaulle's tanks won a tactical success which demonstrated the relevance of his theories. On the front, de Gaulle was fearless, demanding, cold, and scathing with his subordinates. But the French army was already overwhelmed, isolated, pounded by the German Air Force. Colonel de Gaulle sounded the retreat. It was then that Paul Renaud decided to call him. De Gaulle, temporarily appointed Brigadier General, was nominated under Secretary of State in charge of war. His mission was to organize the resistance of the French army. But disaster had already hit, and all he could do was deal with the most pressing issues and content himself with damage limitation. Five days later, the government left Paris, which could no longer be defended. De Gaulle pleaded tirelessly for resistance, but the side that supported a compromise with Hitler was gaining ground every day. Weygand himself, the hero of the 1914 war, began to suggest an armistice, while Winston Churchill implored the French to continue to fight.
We have not lost yet. We have behind us...
Winston Churchill, the charismatic Prime Minister, came to power only months after the declaration of war. But it was too late.
We are stronger at sea than the Germans.
And just like de Gaulle, he was convinced that the fight needed to be carried on at all costs, or else the whole of Europe would be under the heel of the Nazis. He had organised that meeting of 11th of June to obtain assurance from France that they would not leave England alone against Hitler.
We must keep on fighting. We must fight again and again.
Then de Gaulle spoke.
Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. President, if I may?
He discussed an audacious plan which, if it were to be executed quickly, would regain the initiative. He suggested organising a strategic withdrawal of all Allied forces still capable of fighting to Brittany into a fortress from which they would lead the recapture of the territory.
This is what I called the strategy of the Breton enclave.
The German offensive had been so effective because the Allied troops had been scattered on a front line that was several hundred kilometres long. But assembled in Brittany, backed by the sea, protected by the fleet and resupplied from the colonies, the Anglo-French troops could not be surrounded. And so the Germans could no longer impose their blitzkrieg.
In Brittany. And once ready, we would start to attack the east.
As for the government, it would set for Algiers, where it could organise the defence and recapture away from the advancing German troops. A simple and bold plan, but one that defence staff and the supporters of the armistice, Pétain being one of them, all refused. Meanwhile, Churchill was impressed. De Gaulle and Churchill, two giants who came face to face for the first time. They shared a military background, an iron will, a clear vision of the situation and its stakes. They shared a fierce sense of humour, a love for books and history, and an indisputable literary talent. After this first meeting, de Gaulle wrote, "The impression I got strengthened my convictions that Britain, led by such a man, would certainly not yield." And of de Gaulle, Winston Churchill later said, "De Gaulle, a great man, he's arrogant, he's selfish, he considers himself the centre of the universe. Yes, you're right, he is a great man." During the next 4 years, they would have to rub shoulders almost every day. It was a stormy and volatile relationship, but one that would never depart from a mutual respect and admiration. But for now, nothing was decided and anything was possible. A new meeting was fixed in Tours 2 days later between the French government and the British Prime Minister. On that day, Paris was declared an open city. No armed resistance opposed the invaders to try and save the city and its inhabitants. As they were leaving Tours for Bordeaux, the French government heard the wildest of rumours. A communist insurrection had exploded in the capital. Barricades had been erected in the streets. The people's courts were pronouncing one death sentence after another. It took several hours to reach the prefect of Paris, who had stayed behind by phone. He denied all the rumours. The streets were deserted and the population, hidden away behind closed windows, anxiously awaited the entrance of the German troops in the city. Already the first elements of the vanguards of the Wehrmacht had been seen in some districts. The atmosphere was electric. Surrounded on all sides by the naysayers, Renault was forced to ask Churchill what would England do if France were to give up the fight.
Winston, the French government does not forget its solemn commitment to not sign a separate peace agreement, but it no longer has the strength to fight over its territory. Its army is broken. Could England, given the sacrifices already made by the country, consider releasing it from this commitment?
You need to give us time, my friends. You must carry on fighting in Paris, and then after Paris, in the provinces at sea. The British government has the will to break Hitler and his entire regime. So the war will continue, and will only end with our destruction or our victory. That's it. This is my answer to your question.
Taking de Gaulle aside at the end of the meeting, he had apparently whispered to him,
"You are the man with the destiny."
Did he really say it? Years later, de Gaulle admitted that he did not recall. It is certain that on that day, something happened between Charles de Gaulle and Winston Churchill. He would soon urge de Gaulle to embark for England, where Winston would welcome him as the sole legitimate representative of the French government. But at that time, de Gaulle was not yet the most influential military man to serve in the government. 84-year-old Marshal Pétain, who had great popularity among the French people, was the one holding the cards. The confrontation between de Gaulle and Pétain had only just started, or rather, this old dispute had reached its climax. Before 1914, Pétain had also proclaimed new doctrines. While the General Staff had remained with the Napoleonic conceptions of warfare, that of projecting the mass of soldiers to attack the enemy positions, Pétain had realized that modern weapons had changed the situation. "Fire kills," he had said. And in 1914, a few months away from retirement, he was recalled. His cold blood impressed at the time. He was named Commander-in-Chief in Verdun and implemented his defensive principles. He managed to contain the Germans, sparing his soldiers as much as possible, according him resounding popularity in the eyes of the public opinion. From then on, he was to be the victor of Verdun. It didn't matter that Clemenceau judged him to be unbearably pessimistic. In November 1919, he led the victory parade on a white horse along the Champs-Élysées. He became Chief of the General Staff and then Minister of War. However, he had remained on the sidelines of politics, and no one had guessed how much he hated the Republic, which he considered weak and corrupt. In fact, in 1939, he would emerge as a remedy against a widely discredited political class. Paradoxically, Pétain, then head of the army, remembered the young and haughty lieutenant under his command in 1912. It was he who promoted this young officer to a colonel ranking, this young officer and his original ideas which contrasted with the conformism of the military mass. It was Pétain who brought in de Gaulle to the École Militaire for 3 lectures on the philosophy of command. Pétain spoke highly of the Colonel Motors books. Finally, Pétain asked de Gaulle to help him prepare a study book on France and its army. De Gaulle agreed, and somehow became the ghostwriter of the Marshal. But once the text was ready, Pétain wanted to sign it alone, and this infuriated de Gaulle. The Colonel wrote scathing letters to the Marshal, who finally decided not to publish the book. De Gaulle resumed writing it later and published a new version of it under his name. The two men were on bad terms despite a mutual esteem. Yet 7 years later, de Gaulle dedicated his book, The Edge of the Sword, to his old mentor. On that day, while fighting continued in the country, the Germans marched victoriously on the Champs-Élysées. That morning, the French government left Tours in panic to move further away from the capital and join Bordeaux. Harassed by the supporters of the armistice, Paul Renaud was distraught, unable to enforce the continuation of the war. Among this government he was supposed to lead, already there were talks to trust no one but Pétain. The lack of support from the British ally was constantly denounced. Internal enemies were also accused, first the communists and then already the Jews. Some of those on the right-wing side even suggested that Nazi Germany victory would finally do away with this corrupt, atheist and too Jewish-orientated republic and hand it over to this foreign party. Discouraged while he was travelling to Bordeaux, drowning in the endless stream of refugees fleeing south, de Gaulle was considering resigning. He did not want his name to remain associated with the capitulation that seemed more inevitable every hour. Upon his arrival, he went to the maritime prefecture, where Paul Renaud now was, and he cornered him.
You cannot stay here any longer. You must go to Algiers as soon as possible. Are you ready to go there or not?
Yes.
Then I will go to London tomorrow and organise what comes next with the British. Where will I find you?
You will find me in Algiers.
The following night, de Gaulle left Bordeaux to reach Brittany. On the 15th of June in the afternoon, he managed to board a destroyer of the National Navy. During the crossing to the English coast, he asked the captain who commanded the vessel, "Would you continue to fight under the British flag?" The officer said no, that he would not fight for the British. De Gaulle sighed and said, "Being the General de Gaulle today is no joking matter." It was in this dark mood that de Gaulle arrived in London on the morning of the 16th of June. He did not know it yet, but that day was to be a historical moment. Upon his arrival, a French diplomat, Jean Monnet, awaited him. From the onset of the conflict, he had been in charge of the Anglo-French Coordinating Committee in the war industry. An industrialist and banker who had then become a diplomat, Jean Monnet was an atypical character in the French political landscape. After the Great War, he was one of the creators of the League of Nations, where he was also named Deputy Secretary General. Monnet had always defended the idea of a world beyond national antagonisms, where relations between countries would be governed by international laws. Already he dreamed of what would be his life's work, the creation of the United States of Europe, that would bring peace and prosperity to a continent ravaged by incessant wars. What he came to offer de Gaulle on this historic day could be the prelude to the realization of his dream. An outright immediate union project of France and the UK merged into one nation. De Gaulle must, said Monnet, convince Churchill that this union is the only solution to prevent a French armistice request. A crazy idea, as France was close to collapse and England was preparing for a disaster. So crazy that Sir Winston Churchill immediately suggested to his war cabinet to adopt it forthwith. At 4 p.m, when the special meeting of the War Cabinet ended, a document entitled A Draft of the Franco-British Union Proposal was written to be transmitted to the French government. It said that the two governments declare that France and Britain are from this moment no longer two nations, but one under the Franco-British Union. Every French citizen will immediately possess a British citizenship. Every British subject will become a French citizen. The Union will focus all its energy against the power of the enemy wherever the battle might take place. And thus, we will win. The unlimited resources, an invincible fleet, it might indeed take months, possibly years, for all the legal and political problems to be fixed. But in the meantime, the idea of a separate peace agreement with Germany could no longer be contemplated. A little before 5 p.m, de Gaulle called Renaud from Churchill's office at 10 Downing Street.
Mr. President, a unique opportunity has arisen, perhaps the last one.
He told him how the British government approved of the union between the two countries and how the French government should do the same.
Do you realize what you are suggesting to me? Everything that it represents?
Sir, time is of the essence. We must be bold or disappear.
Churchill took the handset.
My dear Paul, listen to me. The only thing that matters at this point is not to give in and to keep fighting.
Renan committed to it. He would ask his government in the next few hours to ratify the Monet project. Following the call with Renan, de Gaulle left for Bordeaux on a plane provided by Churchill. He wanted to be with Renan to support him as quickly as possible. What did he think, this provisional general, Under-Secretary of State in charge of war, in a government that only wished to surrender, as he flew through the clouds towards Bordeaux? Did he really believe in this Franco-British Union? Did he actually believe that Paul Renan alone would convince the French government to support it? No, probably not. But just like Winston Churchill, he thought that this attempt would push away the French capitulation for a few more days, leaving Renan time to reach Algeria and call to continue the fight by all means. A premonition? On his arrival in Bordeaux at 9:30 p.m. on the 16th of June 1940, de Gaulle asked the pilot of his plane not to leave for London, but to wait, just in case. What de Gaulle did not yet know was that Paul Renan had kept his word and had presented the Monet project to the government. The reaction to it had been clear. Did Renan really want to be British? Did he wish for France to have London as its capital and to be solely a British protectorate in the future? No, no, and no. Never would this government accept it. And this insane proposal clearly showed what value should be given to the British alliance. It was better to trust the Germans and to ask them what their requirements to stop fighting were. When the council ended at 7 p.m, Renan submitted his resignation.
This government, I hereby present my resignation.
It was immediately accepted. He would not go to Algiers to continue the war, and as de Gaulle became aware of his resignation on the tarmac of the airport at 10 p.m, the President of the Republic, Albert Lebrun, was asking Marshal Pétain to form a new government. The die was cast. France accepted the defeat. When he met with Renan for the last time a few minutes later, de Gaulle saw him relieved from an intolerable burden. His only wish was to get away from a chaotic world. De Gaulle told him of the decision that he was now forced to take. He would leave in the morning for England, where he would continue to fight with all those among the French who would refuse to surrender. Renan wished him good luck and handed him 100,000 francs from the secret funds of the government. 100,000 francs, a British plane and the disparate remnants of a defeated army was everything Charles de Gaulle could count on to face his destiny on that 16th of June in the evening. In choosing exile, Charles de Gaulle took a huge risk. He knew that his departure would make him a deserter, a traitor, seditious in the eyes of the new government. In a few weeks, this government would actually pronounce his death sentence. Yet from that moment on, he never doubted again until the collapse of Nazi Germany. The defeated, he would say, are those who accept defeat, and I am not one of them. Without a doubt, his state of mind stemmed from his long career in the army and from a highly original political reasoning for the times. A practicing Catholic, he nevertheless spent some time with socialist and radical circles. Before the Great War, he even attended several meetings of Jaurès who fascinated him. His senior instructor at St. Cyr was also a Dreyfus supporter and a socialist. In the 1930s, he had established informal relations with many political figures from all sides of the board without at any time clearly committing to a particular ideological direction. Maybe it was because his political interests were based primarily on an analysis of geopolitical relations of the diplomatic game and of long-term strategy rather than on an ideology promoted by any one party. While the country was collapsing, de Gaulle seemed to be the only one with Winston Churchill in England to possess a clear vision of what this new conflict meant. A globalized world war which Hitler's Germany could only lose in the long run, as it would necessarily have to confront the American and the Soviet powers. History was being written. At 9 a.m, de Gaulle left France aboard the British plane loaned by Winston Churchill. The flight, which lasted 4 hours, was rough. Above Pampon, where his mother was hospitalized, de Gaulle saw that the forest was on fire. This was the last image he took with him of France. At that moment, he later wrote in his memoirs, "I feel like a man who has decided to swim across an ocean alone." His situation was pitiful. He was alone with no other legitimacy than that which the British would choose to grant him. In France, he was still virtually unknown in the eyes of the public opinion. He had neither resources nor troops to continue the fight. Over 100,000 French soldiers had been evacuated from Dunkirk at the end of May, but he had no authority over them. The majority of them waited in distress for the armistice to be signed, to regain the continent and allow them to go home. Despite all of this, de Gaulle began writing an appeal to carry on the fight that would be broadcast on the radio. Churchill promised to let him speak at the BBC. Together they had agreed that he would go on air once the French request for an armistice had been made official. This was done by late afternoon when the voice of Marshal Pétain was broadcast on French radio.
C'est le cœur serré que je vous dise aujourd'hui qu'il faut cesser le combat. Je me suis adressé cette nuit à l'adversaire pour lui demander s'il est prêt à rechercher avec moi, entre soldats, après la lutte et dans l'honneur, les moyens de mettre un terme aux hostilités.
It was time for de Gaulle to make history. Yet everything had gone wrong that morning. Within the British government, not everyone shared Winston Churchill's determination to continue the war against Germany. Some, the first of whom was Lord Halifax, Minister of Foreign Affairs, saw that the French capitulation opened an opportunity for negotiating an armistice. Although not glorious, at least it would avoid the worst, an invasion of the British Isles by this dreaded Wehrmacht that appeared to be unstoppable. Moreover, Pétain's government was the only legitimate one. So why should the microphone of the BBC be handed to that General de Gaulle who represented only himself? But Winston Churchill was a stubborn Prime Minister. One by one, he would convince the members of his war cabinet to let de Gaulle make his appeal.
And they will just fall down on the fact we can win the war.
To do so required the entire afternoon and full use of his diplomatic skills. Almost all of them demanded that de Gaulle softened the tone of his text to show consideration for Pétain, the legitimate leader of the French government. Throughout the day, de Gaulle rewrote his speech several times, before practicing in front of Elisabeth de Miribel, a secretary of the French embassy, who had decided the day before to join what was not yet the Free France. Finally, at 6 p.m, de Gaulle stood, text in hand, in front of a BBC microphone. No one yet realized the importance of this moment. The appeal would not even be recorded.
The leaders who, for many years, have been at the head of the French armies have formed a government. This government, alleging the defeat of our armies, has made contact with the enemy in order to stop the fighting. The war is not over as a result of the Battle of France. This war is a world war. All the mistakes, all the delays, all the suffering do not alter the fact that there are, in the world, all the means necessary to crush our enemies one day. Vanquished today by mechanical force, in the future we will be able to overcome by a superior mechanical force. The fate of the world depends on it. Whatever happens, the flame of the French resistance must never be extinguished and will not be extinguished. Tomorrow, as today, I will speak on the radio from London.
This appeal was heard by very few in France. And rarer still were those who instantly responded to it. But as he had promised, de Gaulle renewed his appeal tirelessly in the days to come.
Croyons que l'honneur des Français.
The Anglo-Saxon press repeated the appeal. In France, it was picked up by word of mouth. And gradually, over the months, the years, the French resistance, whose name was mentioned for the first time this 18th of June 1940 on the microphone of the BBC, became a reality. Gradually, the number of Free French increased. Gradually, the internal resistance became organized. Soviet Russia and the United States of America entered the war against Germany. The war became a global one, as announced by de Gaulle in his appeal. And the great mechanical power used by the Allies did bend the Reich. At the time of the Normandy landings, the Free French forces and the French forces of the interior could rely on more than 500,000 fighters, active on all fronts in Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, on ground, at sea and in the air. On the 26th of August 1944, after more than 4 years of exile and struggle, although the fight against Nazi Germany was not yet over, General de Gaulle, the outcast, the traitor, the deserter, walked down the Champs-Élysées as a winner, hailed by a jubilant crowd.